It's still a ways from now, but the New Orleans Saints should already be compiling their list of future head coaching candidates, and Detroit Lions offensive coordinator Ben Johnson needs to be atop the list. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're continuing our look at what's going on with the New Orleans Saints post the firing of head coach Dennis Allen. We know who the interim head coach is, Darren Rizzi, but who will the New Orleans Saints look at as their long-term candidates come this offseason? We're going to break all of that down here on today's episode, taking a look at 9 different candidates for you to get to know. We'll take a look at Darren Rizzi and why it is that he deserves to be considered at the end of the season, and why the Saints have already sort of indicated that that will be the case or could be the case. We'll take a look at the familiar faces that aren't in the facility that you should know about, and we're going to kick everything off with the crown jewels, right? The ones that everyone's going to be pursuing, leading off with Detroit Lions offensive coordinator Ben Johnson. We got that and much more coming up for you on today's episode. We appreciate you very much for being an everydayer and for making us your first listen of the day every day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. You can download the Game Time app, create an account, and use that promo code Locked On NFL for $20 off your first purchase. The name atop the list for the New Orleans Saints when it comes to their head coaching candidacy and head coaching search at the end of this season needs to be Detroit Lions offensive coordinator Ben Johnson. I've actually got a list of 4 favorites for you to consider, or at least 4 of the names that you're going to hear a lot of over the course of this sort of period, right? There's going to be the Darren Rizzi kind of honeymoon period. Then there's going to be the whatever the first loss happened under Darren Rizzi. Then everyone's going to quickly want to turn their attention to other candidates and things like that. So you're going to hear a lot of these different conversations and everything to kind of see who's going to be the next guy. So let's take a look at some of those candidates, leading off, of course, with Ben Johnson. The guys we're going to talk about as we open up the show: Ben Johnson, Lions offensive coordinator. Brian Flores, Vikings defensive coordinator. Mike Vrabel, former head coach, and Bobby Slowick, Texans offensive coordinator. Those are the ones we're going to go into today. Let's start off with Ben Johnson. If you need to know one thing about Ben Johnson, it's that he has been consistently the sort of belle of the ball, if you will, when it comes to head coaching candidates for probably the last 2 off seasons. And it's going to be a 3rd off season in a row here when the New Orleans Saints re-enter that conversation. The other thing you need to know about Ben Johnson is that his offense right now, over the course of the last 6 games, has thrown more touchdowns than they have thrown incompletions. And that is with Jared Goff as their quarterback. And remember Jared Goff, right? He was somebody that everybody thought was never going to pan out, wasn't going to make it. He was with that Sean McVay offense, couldn't make it in the Sean McVay offense, but he's making it in Ben Johnson's offense. That's how good Ben Johnson has been. And that's why actually I think there's a little bit of a concern when it comes to Ben Johnson in terms of the fact that over the course of the past 2 years, he's been in the head coaching search, but hasn't been somebody that has taken a job yet. That's, of course, a little bit concerning. Does he really want to be a head coach? I think that's worth asking if you're an NFL organization at this point after building up that track record. But now seeing him go back to the Detroit Lions for a 3rd year or for the 3rd year in a row since being considered as a head coach, and have this kind of season, have this kind of output with that offense, that is something that maybe makes you go like, okay, I get it. I get why you went back. I understand. It's like a first overall, or a first round pick draft prospect who's like sure to make some money in the NFL saying, you know what, I'm going back for another year, and then coming out as the first round pick after 1 more year of college football. That's the Ben Johnson of the head coaching search, right? So that's the way that I'm looking at it there. He's going to be the number 1 guy on everyone's list. He should be the number 1 guy on the New Orleans Saints list. Of course, this would complicate things when it comes to the Clint Kubiak of it all, the new offensive coaching staff. So if the Saints want to retain their new offensive coaching staff, but are willing to bring in another defensive play caller / head coach, there are options there as well. We'll start off in terms of that conversation with these 2 guys, Brian Flores, Vikings defensive coordinator, as well as Mike Vrabel, former head coach. Brian Flores is a culture builder. He walks the line between being that authoritarian when needed, but also being the pro player coach when needed as well. I think that there are times where that is necessary. And why not hire both, right? So Brian Flores is one of those guys. His lawsuit against the NFL is stalled in court at the moment. It's not going to cause any issues with him getting a head coaching job. Brian Flores will be a head coach again. And during his time in Miami, it wasn't the worst of times that we saw in Miami. It was just a very interesting and curious situation that led to a lawsuit, right? So there were a lot of different things that you're looking at when it comes to Brian Flores' time over in Miami. But looking at the superior defensive scheme that he has created, he has brought over to Minnesota that has done a phenomenal job. You saw the great work that he did as a part of as part of Pittsburgh's coaching staff as well, working with Mike Tomlin. Give me somebody that's worked with Mike Tomlin if I'm an NFL team. I'm perfectly fine with that. Brian Flores is somebody that kind of walks that line in between being the hard-nosed head coach that's going to hold you accountable, but also being the players coach to where you get the respect of that roster. I like that fit for where the New Orleans Saints are, because the Saints are going to be in the midst of not only hiring a new head coach and trying to get back onto the win column, trying to get back into their winning ways in 2025 and on. They're also going to be rebuilding their culture. And that's another place where a guy like Mike Vrabel comes in. I have incorrectly classified Mike Vrabel as somebody that does not build culture. I have been checked on that. Actually, the biggest thing with Mike Vrabel, where he has sort of his shortcomings, is building the staff. So if the Saints wanted to keep the staff that they have already on the offensive and defensive side when it comes to position coaches, coordinators, things like that, but bring in somebody that can be a head coach that spearheads all of it, Mike Vrabel sounds like the right kind of guy. Now, is he going to be able to guide you through a rebuild? I don't know if that's really his best fit. I think his best fit is probably plugging him into something that's already fully established. The Saints will not be that. So that makes things a little bit maybe more complicated with Mike Vrabel. So I still don't think that he's the greatest fit. But if you want somebody to come in and build culture, it sounds like Mike Vrabel can be that guy. The issues that took place over in Tennessee were kind of around him more than they were about him. And then the issues in terms of the culture issues that were had there in terms of people not seeing eye to eye were about him and the staff, not really about him and the coaching. And knowing the way that the New Orleans Saints organization likes to be in lockstep, I don't know if you want a guy that's going to be willing to go against the grain of your general manager and your owners. Fans might want that, but I don't think that Gail Benson, New Orleans Saints owner, and Mickey Loomis, New Orleans Saints general manager, are going to be up for that kind of challenge. And then finally, we'll take a look here at Bobby Slowick, the offensive coordinator of the Texans. He has had a phenomenal run with the Texans through his first couple of years, built an offensive rookie of the year trajectory for CJ Stroud, helped to get, along with DeMeco Ryans, that Houston Texans team to the playoffs last year, or in that playoff conversation last year. That is something that you look at and you see the immediate success. The big thing is he a leader, right? Like, is he going to be the guy that's going to be too player friendly, or is he going to be able to be the accountability guy? Like you're hearing from Darren Rizzi saying, I'm accountability guy. Is that something you're going to be able to get from Bobby Slowick? I don't think we know that yet because we haven't seen him in that position, but we're going to bring on some folks that cover these teams to talk about these guys and maybe learn a little bit more about Bobby Slowick in that area. But hey, if you're looking for a quarterback developer, Slowick might be the guy that's worth investing in and going sort of the wonder kid route when it comes to what's available on the market. All right, coming up next, we'll take a look at the familiar faces that you need to keep an eye out on, but not the guys that are already in the building. I'm talking about guys that have departed, matured, and could potentially come back. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints for the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends over at Game Time, the best place to go to buy all of your tickets for your favorite events, whether it's sports, concerts, musicals, theater, whatever it is that you're into. You're going to be able to find it over at Game Time, and Game Time makes it even easier. They give you all-in pricing, which you can toggle on so you're not taken by surprise by any big fees by the end of your shopping endeavor there for your favorite events. They also make sure that you have views from your seats, and with Game Time Picks, it's a curated experience that helps you to be able to kind of pick your best events and get those best deals without having to sift through the thousands and thousands of seats that are available all over at Game Time. So go and check them out today. You can take all the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Once again, create an account and use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Today's episode of Locked On Saints also brought to you by friends over at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL season with America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can put $5 down and then you'll get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. First $5 bet for new customers, $150 in bonus bets if it wins. That's what FanDuel Sportsbook app is giving you. And the app also gives you everything you need all in one place. You're to place your bets, track stats, view play-by-play, and more. Right now, you can get on the action if you want to with the New Orleans Saints. The Saints right now are underdogs going up against the Atlanta Falcons here at home. Does Darren Rizzi give the team a little bit of that one-game bump, right? That new coach bump. You can find that over at FanDuel and get in on that action. Just head over to FanDuel.com to join today. And you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Never waste a hunch. And of course, make every moment more with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel, which is an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, family, continuing on, take a look at some of the familiar faces that the New Orleans Saints could consider in their upcoming coaching search. And I want to lead it all off, taking a look at a couple of guys that have been here in New Orleans, ended up going elsewhere, went through maybe some trials, tribulations, or simply matured, and then ended up finding their way. Potentially, this is a chance for them to find their way back to New Orleans to be able to go. Now, here's the thing that I'm going to say real quick. I don't think this is the correct route for the New Orleans Saints to go. I think the best route for the New Orleans Saints to go is if they're going to hire a familiar face to go right back to Darren Rizzi and let him continue and guide you through your rebuild and all those other things. But I think more importantly, this is a New Orleans Saints team that needs to go outside of the facility. They need to turn the page on the Sean Payton era and the leftovers of the Sean Payton era. And they need to go out there and invest in new faces, new ideas, and new perspectives in order to be able to get into their new era of New Orleans Saints football. But despite that, I still want to take a look at some of these candidates because they are going to be popular candidates. So let's take a look at who could potentially be available. We'll start off with Aaron Glenn, Detroit Lions defensive coordinator. The Lions, of course, are going to be a very popular team when it comes to farming potential head coaches, and that's all about their offensive coordinator and their defensive coordinator. Aaron Glenn effectively runs the same system that Dennis Allen runs. So if you're looking for continuity for some of your defense that you plan to maintain and all those other things, that's an opportunity to bring him in. The issue when it comes to Aaron Glenn, and if I'm Aaron Glenn, I'm really weary of this idea, very wary of this idea, because I don't want to be the coach that's brought in to guide a rebuild for 2 years and then get fired and then end up having somebody else bank off of all my work because they bring in somebody else to be the head coach. And Aaron Glenn could potentially end up being that kind of candidate for a team like the New Orleans Saints, looking at bringing in somebody familiar, somebody cozy, somebody comfortable, and then letting them guide your rebuild before turning the page on them. I don't think the New Orleans Saints should do that. I think Aaron Glenn deserves more than that. I think the New Orleans Saints deserve more than that. I think that the player roster deserves more than that as well. Not that Aaron Glenn wouldn't be a good coach. It's just that I don't like the way that situation sets up for the defensive coach that's coming in to maintain the head coach that you just fired's system. That just doesn't feel very comfortable. That doesn't feel very good. And if I'm Aaron Glenn, I'm saying thanks, but no thanks if I get a phone call, if my agent or my manager gets a phone call from the New Orleans Saints. All right, let's take a look at another familiar face that's gone away, had some trials and tribulations, and then could potentially make his way back. That, of course, is Joe Brady, offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills. And we'll keep this conversation going with Jon Gruden, former Las Vegas Raiders head coach, former Tampa Bay Buccaneers head coach, Super Bowl winner, all those things. Both these guys, familiar faces, just for different reasons. Joe Brady, of course, was the assistant to the head coach for New Orleans here with Sean Payton, and then ended up moving over to the LSU Tigers and helping to create what was an incredible offense back in 2019, along with the help of others. It wasn't just him, but he did a lot of work with the wide receivers and helped that offense really kind of get off the ground and soar, right, to historic lengths, that 2019 LSU championship team. He then came off of that, carried that momentum into becoming the offensive coordinator with the Carolina Panthers, and that did not work out. Went back to college, or went back and then ended up with the Buffalo Bills as working with him as their quarterbacks coach, and then becoming eventually their offensive coordinator last year after Dorsey was fired. And then they ended up promoting Joe Brady. He did a phenomenal job with Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills, and he's now their full-time offensive coordinator. So shows you a little bit of the adversity that he's faced, his ability to be able to navigate that. I think that's a good quality. I have the same concerns with Joe Brady that I have with Aaron Glenn, however. You bring in Joe Brady to try to get a taste of that Sean Payton system back again, and then those Sean Payton days again, and then all of a sudden, bang, you're right back in a situation to where you are looking at a guy for a couple of years and then potentially moving on from him because they got you through the rebuild, and then now you go out and sell your better product that you'll have in 2 years to a different head coach. Again, I don't think that that's the route that the Saints should go. Jon Gruden. Jon Gruden's a really interesting one because I think if you hire Jon Gruden, and the reason why Jon Gruden is familiar for the Saints, by the way, in case you missed it, is how much Jon Gruden has been involved over the course of the past couple of years, coming in, visiting during off seasons, kind of holding unofficial roles with the team and all those other things during training camps, yada, yada. So that's why Jon Gruden is considered a familiar face, even though he hasn't actually been employed by the team in those specific ways. So for that, I would have to look at Jon Gruden as a real possibility for New Orleans. I spoke to actually some people on the New Orleans Saints staff last offseason who were completely convinced that Jon Gruden was going to be the new offensive coordinator for the team going into this offseason. And of course, or going into the 2024 season, it ended up being Clint Kubiak after all. I think the big thing when it comes to Jon Gruden is, again, you're trying to build culture and all those other things. What's the balance between his emails that include like racist and misogynistic and homophobic language and everything like that? What's the balance between that for players and the balance between him being a coaching, like a culture builder as a coach? Because he has been a solid culture builder as a coach, but how much of a stain does he now have on that reputation because of those emails and things like that? So it's a little bit of a tricky one to walk. I think you put yourself, if you're the New Orleans Saints, right into the crosshairs of a lot of scandal if you end up going that route, or at least early conversations of scandal. But then if you start winning games, all that scandal will conveniently fade away. So the Saints would have to sort of juggle a little bit or balance a little bit of what's the challenge of hiring a Jon Gruden versus what's the benefit of hiring a Jon Gruden. Because we have never seen Jon Gruden be fully successful with a roster that wasn't built for him before he showed up, right? That Tampa Bay roster was not his roster, right? That was a roster that was built before he showed up. Great defense. And then he brought a little bit of an offense there, and then he won a Super Bowl. So I don't know that he's going to be really the greatest fit in terms of guys that you want to bring in to kind of take charge of a rebuild, in that he has shown an inability to be able to rebuild franchises in his previous stops. So kind of on the Mike Vrabel side of it, but for different reasons, seems more like a guy that you bring in when you have something closer to a finished product, as opposed to where the Saints are now, where they're going to be laying a foundation. Finally, if you want to go the Wonder Kid route again, and you don't want to necessarily go the Bobby Slowick route, you could go Liam Cohen. Liam Cohen, the Bucs offensive coordinator, is familiar because he's the Bucs offensive coordinator, so you faced his offense multiple times already this season. So you already got a good look at him. You kind of know, you're familiar with what it is that he does, what he wants to do on offense, all those other things. But the other side of that too is that he's somebody that the Saints have pursued before as an offensive coordinator, but then he went back to Kentucky as an OC. He was in Kentucky, then he was working with the Los Angeles Rams in that McVay system. The Saints wanted him after that. He ends up going back to the college ranks, ends up back in Kentucky, and then ends up coming back to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And so Liam Cohen could be a guy that we have seen the Saints kind of pursue already, show some interest in, and then ends up landing back an opportunity for an even bigger role based on having Baker Mayfield in the MVP conversation early on in the season, being able to revitalize the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense up until they lost Chris Godwin and Mike Evans due to injury, all those other things. So the Saints wanted the wide zone system. This is the McVay version, the McVay side of the wide zone system, while Kubiak was the Shanahan side of the wide zone system. So could be another route for the New Orleans Saints to go. All right, coming up next, I don't think we should leave Darren Rizzi out of the conversation because these last 8 games could potentially earn him a full-time role. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. There's a lot of people around you that deserve thanks. There's a lot of people around me that deserve thanks. I had somebody sacrifice for me just today so that I could be here and cover and do all the things that I had to do with the firing and all the news and all this other stuff. I have you to thank for being here through a 7-game losing skid. Now there's all this excitement about the future, but you were still here when that excitement wasn't necessarily there. And because of that, you have helped to change my life. Like everybody deserves thanks from that side. And you know who else deserves thanks that we don't often say thank you to? It's ourselves, right? When was the last time you really thanked yourself for taking care of yourself, making the right choices for you and the people around you? That's something I learned through therapy. It's one of the reasons why I love BetterHelp, because BetterHelp gave me access to therapy in a way that I maybe didn't before. It's designed to be suited to your schedule because it's entirely online. It's convenient. No waiting rooms, nothing like that. It's no traffic, makes it very accessible to you. So go and try them out. Like, let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off of your first month. It's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. get it, Who Dat Nation. On top of all of the different candidates outside of the facility of the New Orleans Saints should be considering new, familiar, whomever, one of the people that is very likely going to work their way into also being considered is interim head coach Darren Rizzi. Listen, I've spoken many, many times over the course of the last couple of weeks about why Darren Rizzi is the right decision for the New Orleans Saints when it comes to interim head coach. And while I think the Saints are likely to look outside the facility, new face, new perspective, new ideas, all those other things, there is the reality in which Darren Rizzi earns the full-time head coaching role, at least for a little while longer, right? We can see, we've seen sort of situations like this in the past with Rich Bisaccia, who took over for Jon Gruden when he was let go when he resigned over with the Raiders. And then he became that interim head coach, and the Raiders performed incredibly well under Bisaccia, but then they went and hired Mike McDaniels. Terrible decision. Then Mike McDaniels gets fired in season, and then Antonio Pierce comes in and takes over as the interim head coach. Then the Raiders go with Antonio Pierce, and that doesn't feel like that's been the right decision either. And so we can see examples of each of these things working out, right? Interim becoming full-time and not working out, interim not becoming full-time, hiring somebody else, that not working out. And we can see examples of the other ways around. Remember, at one time, Dan Campbell, who's now the head coach of the Detroit Lions, was an interim head coach with the Miami Dolphins before he came here to New Orleans and then went to Detroit. Like, we see these type of success stories build in a bunch of different ways, and we see failures in a bunch of different ways as well. But if the New Orleans Saints want to get this right, they're going to have to explore every option. And the Saints have done this before. Back in 2022, when they interviewed candidates post Sean Payton, not only Dennis Allen wasn't the only inside internal guy that they interviewed. He was the one that they hired. But remember that Darren Rizzi was on that interview list as well. And we've spoken about like the special team side of it all, right? Being a special teams guy and having connections with everybody on the roster, being an assistant head coach as well, gives you connections with the other guys on the roster that maybe you wouldn't otherwise typically connect with, like quarterback and all that, the starters, everything. But Darren Rizzi is unique in that way. And so he has a relationship with every single player on the roster, 53 to the 16 on the practice squad, understands how to develop young players, teach young players, is a big-time culture builder, and is an accountability guy. And if he can come in and live out his promise, and one of the big promises that I love that he made on his introductory press conference as interim head coach is that he said, "We won't be boring to watch. I'll promise you that." And so we'll see. Now, the biggest thing is that the Saints have to be very careful here because you can't mistake fun for productive, right? So you would have to do this with an eye on the right category, right? The right rubric. The Saints could benefit from being one of the latest teams to move away from play caller head coach and instead having a coordinator that calls plays, on offense, a coordinator that calls plays on defense, and then a head coach that is your figurehead, that is your culture builder. If Darren Rizzi, who Foster Moreau, New Orleans Saints tight end, called an unbelievable leader of men, can be that unbelievable leader of men, be that person that helps to develop, that charges, that gets people going, that builds that culture, that brings unity on this roster, I think you have to consider him. And not only do you have to consider him, you should want to consider him in that situation. Here's the thing that ties every single one of these potential coaching candidates together, and that I think is massively important. What the New Orleans Saints must show is something that they have shown over and over again. Whether they go with the new face like a Brian Flores or a Ben Johnson, whether they go with a highly respected but familiar face, right? Or highly respected and familiar face. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive for one another. Aaron Glenn or Joe Brady. They need to have patience. I discussed Aaron Glenn and the risk of showing up, being a little bit of a rehash, bringing in and maintaining the same defensive system that Dennis Allen has, and then being moved on from once they navigate the rebuild, and then they sell his product to some other head coach as like, look how great this product is that we built, when Aaron Glenn was the guy that you kind of had come in and pioneer throughout that, the Lovie Smith type of hire, like we've seen around the NFL before. You have to avoid that. So the thing that's going to separate that, the thing that's going to make that appealing for any head coach, Aaron Glenn, Joe Brady, Jon Gruden, whomever, is patience. And the New Orleans Saints have shown, sometimes to a fault, that they will do that they will be patient. I'd say that the firing of Dennis Allen is long overdue. We talked about it at the end. We talked about it after the Rams game last year, that maybe it's a decision that they should have made going into the offseason, even though we knew that they wouldn't. But the conversation wasn't, do we think that they will? The conversation is, do we think that they should? The answer to one of those questions was yes. The answer to one of those questions was no. I'll let you figure it out. You know what I mean? But I think that for New Orleans, the next step is understanding that this is not going to be a 1-year process. And honestly, they're better served with it not being a 1-year process. They need this to be a multi-year, take your time, embrace where you are, stop looking at yourselves as contenders, and instead building a true contender. Because I can say I'm a millionaire all I want, but until I got racks in the bank that show that I'm a millionaire, I ain't a millionaire, right? So don't tell everybody that you're a contender. Go and build a contender. And you know what that takes? It takes patience. Look at the Buffalo Bills. Patience. Look at the Detroit Lions. Patience. Houston Texans. Patience? Question mark. I mean, a lot of it happened pretty immediately for them, but they were willing to be patient. And they were this unique blend of patient and aggressive, right? Going out and get CJ Stroud, then trade up again and go up there and get Will Anderson. Go and get the guys that you know are going to translate to what it is that you do best in the NFL draft. That's something the New Orleans Saints have to do as well. They need to evaluate everything. Everything. You got to look at your scouting. You got to look at your draft. You got to look at your general management. You got to look at your position coaches. You got to look at your medicals. You got to look at all this stuff, right? Medicals in terms of preparation stuff, right? Like there's a lot for this New Orleans Saints team to look at. They don't need to rush through it in one offseason. Take your time. I think if the intent here and the goal is to build a true contender, no one's going to be upset if that takes a couple years, if you're doing it right. And if you can see the progress. Progress might not show up in the win-loss column. I'll tell you that right now. But the progress will show up in building talent and building culture and understanding where you are as a football team and taking advantage of that. That's where the New Orleans Saints have to be. So whether they hire Ben Johnson, whether they hire Jon Gruden, whether they hire Aaron Glenn, whether they keep Darren Rizzi, patience is going to lead to success. Impatience is going to lead to further failure. That's going to be the massive difference maker in this next handful of years for the New Orleans Saints. Will they achieve success? Will they return to the playoffs in that time, or will they not? Patience is going to be the key ingredient that gets them there. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to take a look at the players that survived the trade deadline and are the young players that the New Orleans Saints should build around, headlined by cornerback Alontae Taylor, who I think has everything that it takes to become the Saints' next star player. We got that coming up for you in tomorrow's episode. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen. For your second listen, make sure you're going to check out Locked On NFL, all the news around the league covered there on 2 episodes a day. And we appreciate you very much for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing, them, how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.